Lots and lots of stuff on the bench today, but we're going to talk about weathering. Lots and lots and lots of ways to do weathering. We've done a whole bunch of this stuff, seen it done exceptionally well, and we're just going to take this time with the bench video today to just basically go over like different ways of getting a weathering effect, and introduce an interesting weathering sort of project that I started here recently. So this body, for instance, is it's a hard body ABS. And then Matt Kett from Scale Builders Guild did the paint job on it, and it's a series of layers of paint. One of them is actually an actual steel infused paint. So one way to get weathering is actually to use a paint that's iron based as one of the layers, and then as soon as it's exposed, it starts to oxidize, obviously, all on its own. That's one way of creating a rust effect, is to actually do it with legitimate, iron-based paint. This is also weathered in here, the cage work, and the cage work is actually also actual steel as far as material, but it was painted very, very lightly with two different layers. First of all, it was painted black, and then after that it was dusted brown, so that it actually started off kind of looking weathered. But in the process of being used, it has also taken on a bunch of scratches and nicks, and then because it's also an iron-based product, it's actually a solid steel tube, 1018 steel, it's rusting all on its own. So there's two examples right there between, fabricated steel on plastic and then actual steel just doing its job. Now, this is yet another version. Basically, to get these weathered wheels, I started off with the new SSD D-hole 1.9 beadlock, and all I did to turn that into something weathered was actually I just sprayed paint on a rag. I mean, it was that easy. I don't think I have it here anywhere, but I sprayed paint onto a rag. I stuffed the rag right into the rim and just started turning it around and just making a mess. And you can either leave lots of goopy paint in there, like just brown paint. You can either leave it in there, or you can keep rubbing with the rag and actually get the paint back out. So you can create an effect, like an amount of weathering based on how much paint you leave or take away. And the cool part about that is it actually, where the rag doesn't actually wipe it out very well, is kind of around all the edges, like the bolts and stuff. And that's where the weathering would naturally be anyway, so it actually is a decent effect. That works pretty well. Now, I like to weather my entire chassis, and that's kind of the segue into this next section of this project here that I want to show on the bench. So this truck is completely weathered. After it was built, the drive shafts were masked off or removed, so the shafts were just masked at the end. The tires were taken off. The electronic plugs were covered over with a piece of tape to make sure that there was no spraying on top of that. Any of the any of the stuff like shocks, the shocks were masked off so that the shock bodies don't actually get paint on the shock body. But after that, the entire truck went, with the exception of the body, the entire truck went in the paint booth to get sprayed with multiple layers of very thin dustings of black and green and brown, and all flat paint, of course. And so you've got this pre-dirtied look, which is, I think, really important on the trail. So it's pretty hard to actually get the lighting on the bench right in there on the diff, but I mean, the diff and the knuckles and the springs and the tie rods and everything have all been weathered. So that's the idea. The idea is that you can use layers of paint dust to create some really interesting weathering effect, and it's very, very thin. The dust that you see here is really just enough to get rid of the reflections that happen from underneath the truck. So there's just, all it does is take away the shiny stuff, you know, that's about it. So that's one truck, a bunch of different ways of doing weathering, and that will help out, I think, to try to get some of this stuff figured out for the rest of y'all. Now, let's move on to the Comanche Weathering. This truck, for instance, was painted with flat paint, as you know from watching the On the Bench series. The truck needed to be kind of an old work truck. It just had to be. So I did layer the paint on this as well. The weathering technique on this is really quite simple because the truck was primed with dark colors. It wasn't a white primer or a gray primer. I used blacks and flat green and flat brown as the base colors before I put the white on. The white is also flat, so that helps give it the aged look. But then what happens is, as soon as you start sanding the corners, you can see here, like I just did a little extra sanding here after the white was on, and that lets you bleed through some of those darker colors, and it gives you the effect of corrosion or weathering or sun fade or any of that stuff. You can see up here as well, all along this door seam here on the edge of the door. I masked off with tape this section of the truck so that this section of the truck actually didn't get any sandpaper on it. And then when I'm sanding here, I don't have to worry so much about, you know, getting it across the door jamb. All I have to do is sand here, and then the piece of masking tape that's over top of this section keeps it from taking the paint off the wrong spot. On the roof, the same. Basically on the roof, I just kind of went over it with, I used a Scotch-Brite pad for my weathering on this, so you can just kind of smooth, it basically just shines the paint until eventually you get to the next layer, so that's really quite simple. Now, one of the questions that came up, John gave us, I think it was John, gave us this question on the YouTube channel: how did we do the wiper mess? So, this was a two-stage process. What I did with the wiper mess was actually, first of all, I laid the wipers out on the truck, so I knew where they were in relation to the windshield. And then what I did is I taped over the windshield, the entire thing. So I completely covered the windshield with tape. At this point, by the way, this windshield was not actually glued in to the cabin. It was fitted and sanded and fitted so that it was a perfect match. And then I masked off the entire thing, dropped it in the truck, laid the wiper where I thought it was going to go, and then I actually drew a line like this with a pencil. I just kind of pivoted around where the wiper pivot is, and I drew a line on the masking tape here, okay? So this one the same, I just kind of pivoted a pencil, a line on the tape, and then I did the inside here, just a little pivot line on the inside of the wiper blade as well, like this. And then I took the windshield back off. This windshield frame just comes right out on this particular hard body. And I took the windshield frame off, and then I drew a proper line with a pencil on top of the masking tape to complete the circuit kind of thing, to make a complete, you know, wiper mark for both sides. And then I just knifed it out very gently. I knifed the tape off to make a line where I had put the pencil marks, okay? So I took off this section of the tape. I took off the tape that doesn't have the wiper mark, and then I was left with this wiper cover. So I put the windshield in the paint booth. I dusted it with my browns and my black paint dust, like the same thing I do on the chassis sets for this thing. I did the same thing here to try to get the windshield kind of that dirty look, pre-dirt, you know. And then I took the tape off the windshield sections, so this was all perfectly clear. And then I got a Scotch-Brite pad and actually just went over it again with a Scotch-Brite pad where the tape had been removed. So instead of having a perfectly smooth windshield, I actually have kind of like wiper marks, you know, which on a truck of this age is really quite likely. It's quite likely that if you go and see this thing in a mall parking lot, it's going to look kind of, you know, wipered and scraped up, and that's how it's going to look. Now, I will say that having done this now on the Comanche, I've done this a couple of times, but having done it with this exact method, with the tape and whatever on the Comanche, I decided that this was not the best method. Sometimes that happens, you know, we all kind of learn and grow in our hobby, and this is one of the things that I don't want to do again. And so that segues into my next project, which I'm going to kind of introduce to the On the Bench. The car is already done, but I'll introduce it anyways. So with this method in mind, I now have a new method, and this is what it is. This one here is this is the Tamiya Rally Bug, by the way. It's the MF-01X chassis. It's now complete. The car is complete. I'll show you that in a minute and how I weathered it. But I did the windshield on this as well, and I wanted to show it to you because I used a very slightly different method. So I'll try to clean up the dust out of it here, make it as smooth, as nice as I can, so you can see how subtle this actually is. Now, it's probably going to be very hard to see this in the video, and I really don't know if it's going to show up, but there are 2 wiper marks on this body. Very subtle. Maybe I can put something dark behind it. I'm going to see if I can find something dark to put behind it. That'll probably help a lot. So I'm going to use this black GCM toque, which by the way you can get at the store, and oddly enough we also have gray. So I'm going to use this. I'm going to stick this in here and see if I can get that to show up a little better. This still might not work, but well, it might work. Okay, so I did a lot less weathering on this windshield than I did on the Comanche, as you can see. But maybe with that little bit of a light change right there, you can kind of see it. There's a really faint wiper mark, but what you'll notice different between the Bug and the Comanche is there's no line on the window. Okay? What I did with this one is I did exactly the same method. I taped the entire windshield off. I figured out where the wipers were actually going to go on the vehicle. I drew it on with some pencil. But then I removed the entire piece of tape and put it on the table. I stuck it to the bench before cutting it out. And then I put it back on the vehicle to separate it, to peel off the different layers. So what ended up happening with this one is that I still got the paint effect. It's very minor on this car because the car is, it's definitely dusty and dirty. There's some pretty obvious dust and weathering on the vehicle, but what there isn't is the same level of change, the same level of weathering. It's dusty and dirty and old, but it is not like the truck. So I wanted no line on the window, and that was the method that I think I will probably use going forward. And I apologize in advance for that being so difficult to see in the video. It is very faint, I admit. And what I will do is after the wipers get attached to this vehicle, I will do a little bit of scratching on it with a Scotch-Brite, the same way I did with this one, but the wipers are yet to be put on. So my new recommendation for this, had I known about this earlier and thought this through, I would have cut out these tape lines off of the windshield. That's the change. That's it. So that pretty much covers what's going on with the Comanche weathering. This truck is waiting for my straight six to come from Dion, who's making an incredible straight six engine for it. So I'm looking forward to that. And I showed you a little bit about what's going on with the Bug body, but then just in keeping with the same spirit as the chassis weathering that I showed you on the 40, this is the chassis that I'm set up to run on the Tamiya. The MF-01 required a little bit of work to make this up to speed for myself. One of them was to put magnetic body mounts on it, of course, because that's critical as far as I'm concerned. And I had to make a little block of balsa wood in the rear section to straighten out the body mounts, because the body mount went right through the very deep angle on the back window, and that was unreasonable for magnets. So I did make a little flat balsa filler in there. And then the fronts are just, of course, they're glued on like normal. And this entire chassis came in pretty much a bright gray color. You can actually see it right here along the drive shaft where I've masked it off. You can see the bright gray there. And then it's pretty clear that it's been weathered into browns and black. So certainly on the bottom you can see that. The entire thing is just earth toned, you know, all the way along. And I like this a lot better. A lot better. The arms and the back, I guess the bearing carriers in the back were bright red. Bright red is simply just not acceptable to show up in car pictures and videos. It's just not. So all of these parts right here were all bright red. You can see a little bit of tint of it left over, but all that happened for this car for weathering is I simply put the car in the paint booth with the wheels off, with the shock towers off, the body mount towers off, and I masked over the shocks so that the shock hardware is actually still painted and whatnot, and so there's no, you know, silver parts here for spacers or nuts or hardware or anything. I masked off the shock body. This section here was covered over, and then the entire car, wiring, ESC, servo, everything, the entire car, with the exception of this four-wheel drive center shaft, got painted with earth tones, with browns and flat black, and I just sort of dusted it on. That's it. Just to get rid of that red. There was red here in the suspension, and the hardware was all bling bling, and it had to get changed. So I really like the way this turned out. I also dusted the rims. You can actually see it. That's really cool. And basically before the tires were put on the rim got dusted with the same earth tones as the chassis. And when I say dusted, this is what I mean. I mean that the rims were in the paint booth over there, and I was over here with the spray can. I mean, there was like 2 feet of space between the spray can and the rim. And my booth has a very heavy draft. Okay, I have an updraft booth that goes in a 7-inch, you know, vent straight out the roof of the building. And these parts were inside, and so the airflow was all going in this direction. And basically all I did was introduce paint colors to the airflow and allow it to get onto the rim. That works great. And you can see the result here is you get a nice dusty looking aged rim instead of, you know, bling bling perfect plastic. There's no rally car in the world has perfectly clean wheels, especially if it's ever been rallied. So the chassis, on the other hand, that was a little more direct painted because there's more detail, and I had to paint the chassis as with all the other chassis weathering. When I did the dust work on this, I painted it, you know, from this direction. I also painted it from this direction. I turned the chassis and painted it on this side and on this side, and so it really gets the dust coming to it from every direction. But the space between the paint can and the vehicle is actually considerably less, down to like a foot or 18 inches, because you actually want to get some paint onto the vehicle. You're actually trying to cover, you know, material. You're not just creating an effect, you're actually covering material so it doesn't look bright gray anymore, and that to me is a big deal. Neither do I want the electronics to show up in the interior and the windows and stuff. So there's the new projects. I'm pretty excited about this one, and I was really happy to be able to get to do some work on this fantastic MF-01 over the weekend. It was kind of my own personal weekend project. And the chrome too, I dusted in the chrome the same method that I'm talking about with the wheels. Got the chrome all dusted in, and it looks so much better having some kind of aged look to it. I'm really happy with how this car turned out, and very excited to see it in pictures and videos and stuff, and it's a really wonderful kit to build. Besides all that, you can see I've also dusted in the chrome light bezels, front bumper, and it matters. I think it really changes the look of the vehicle. Now, that's where I'm on. That's where we're at with the On the Bench. This is going to get asked for anybody that's a Tamiya fan and looking at this car, trying to figure out what the heck shocks did you put on this thing, because these are really freaking nice. They give me the full suspension travel. I'm using them in all the factory positions on the Tamiya car. And what could they possibly be? Well, simple enough. All the scale trucks, I'm using exactly the same shocks. This is the shock right here. It's the ECX 213000. This is a set of 4 pre-built plastic shocks. They come with springs, they come with spacers, they come with eyes for 2mm hardware. Nobody uses 2mm hardware on these trucks, so we pop all the eyes out of the shock end, and then we put a rubber O-ring on each side. Here's a picture of how we actually assemble the shocks when they go on the trucks, and that is exactly the same method that I used on the Tamiya car. You can see it here where we've got a flathead screw here, and then there's a O-ring, the shock, another O-ring, a nut, and then there's a, in this case there happens to be a spacer to make sure the shock was aligned correctly with the suspension. So really simple setup. These shocks are very economical. They're already pre-filled. I don't think I've had any of them actually leak ever. I really like the way they're designed, and it just so happens that they're the perfect shock for a Tamiya MF-01, so highly recommended. Thanks for watching On the Bench yet again, and hopefully there's some weathering tips there that can help you out. Cheers.